Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending another series of the ISI Natural Language Seminar. Today, we have Michael Saxon from UCSB, who is a CHP candidate in the NLP group. His research is driven by a desire to improve our objective understanding of the semantic capabilities for large generative AI systems, and particularly generative image and language models. Towards this goal, he focused on developing novel data resources and metrics to model semantic phenomena in generative models, as well as techniques for model-driven data set improvement to remove biases and spurious correlations. It's a pleasure to have him here. I've met Michael while interning at Meta, and so it's really exciting to have him back here in person to give us a talk, and I'm super excited about what he has to share today. So without further ado, let's welcome Michael.
Thanks, Justin. If I knew you were going to read the bio out loud, maybe I wouldn't have made it quite as wordy, but yeah, thanks. All right, so the title of this talk, Cultural Knowledge and Cultural Biases, Analyzing the Multilingual Performance of Text-to-Image Models. The first part is going to come at the end, and the beginning is going to be the second part of that title. So just giving you a warning, that's a little, the bias and knowledge part is going to kind of come at the end, but yeah, so this work really only started for me last year. I used to be just a pure language only guy, but I started getting interested in text to image models when it got to the point where there were just so many freely available demos that you could just play around with them on their own. And this work was originally inspired actually while I was at my internship with Justin, and I had a little bit of idle time, and I was just playing around with DALL-E. So there's a couple of questions about text to image models that I'm pretty interested in. So the first is this general, like, how do we capture the creativity that these generative systems have? Now, these three issues that I'm going to talk about are going in ascending order of feasibility of measurement. So obviously it's very difficult to measure like creativity or capture that in a way, but I really like to think in terms of how can I break this down into something concrete and measurable. So one thing that is a common thread throughout all of the creative demos. I always have to scare quote creative. The creative demos from these text image systems is that they involve coordinating some existing set of concepts that the model possesses as knowledge. Then it can coordinate them in a creative way, combine them with stylistic attributes and things that are requested, and then produce a coherent output. So what mechanism enables them to creatively combine these concepts? Well, in order to measure that, first we need a way to just assess the concepts that they know. And that leads into issue number 2. So we don't actually have a way to just analyze a model as a black box from the outside and say, does it know this thing? Does it not know that concept? And that is an important problem to solve because a lot of directions of interest that people have involve like adding new concepts in. So taking a previously non-existent object and adding it in through like low rank adaptation or other techniques. So having a metric to actually assess whether a model knows a concept or not is desirable. And finally, and this was the inciting incident for this paper, is that we can't predict the ways that models will fail in deployment. So this example is the toying around that I did. So the first thing that I did when I had access to DALL-E Mini was I was like, okay, let's just try a dumb, simple prompt. Okay, big dog. So I typed it in, got some pictures of big dogs, makes sense. And then I was like, well, I know Spanish as well, so let's see if DALL-E Mini knows some Spanish. Well, I wouldn't say I'm a super amazing speaker of Spanish, but I at least know how to say big dog is perro grande. And so put it in, wow, those are some perro grandes. Then I was like, okay, well, let's try languages that are non-European. Let's try things that are more further afield. Now, I don't know Indonesian, but I know that Indonesian is a Latin alphabet language and that it's not genetically related to Indo-European languages. So I was like, that would be a good one to test. So I Google translated big dog into Indonesian and it worked. And I was like, wow, okay, so this model, which was ostensibly only trained on English data, is actually generalizing to languages that don't have, you know, collisions and stuff. So that's pretty good. Okay, let's push a little farther. Let's try a non-European language with a non-Latin script alphabet. So it will be tokenized differently. Okay, let's see, big dog in Japanese. What the heck? So that was the inciting incident here. We have this weird offensive collision that's happening. That's totally unpredictable. And I just wanted to find more of them. So I was like, how can I, with minimal assumptions, find more of these outputs? So first, I'm going to sort of put you guys in my mindset of philosophy for thinking about T2I models by talking about just the really high level what's going on here. So apologies for this being kind of basic, but there are two things in a text and image model. You have a text encoder, and then you have an image decoder. Pretty simple. And the way that we used to make these is just to train it all from scratch. So take your paired data, train a GAN or something, get some cool latent vectors and stuff, and okay, cool, we can control this. We can get a smile vector out and generate a smiling picture from an input. But in general, the open domain deployment of these was pretty limited. The data resources just aren't there for the label combinations, and also just the idea of prompting was not in the conceptual inventory. It wasn't in the milieu, whatever, around the time when people were originally playing with GANs, like 2016, 2018, etc. So then when we got into the pre-training paradigm, now we can take a pre-trained text encoder or a pre-trained image decoder. And when I compare text image models, the biggest thing that I'm thinking of is which piece is pre-trained and then which one is adapted and trained in the supervised learning setting. And when you think in these terms, it becomes very straightforward to compare different models. So for example, although there's a lot of lower level architectural differences between DALL-E 2 and Stable Diffusion, the highest level difference is that DALL-E 2 is taking a pre-trained representation space that ties the text images. Then it is adapting a image decoder to fit to that space. And it's relying on the generalization in this paired space to come downstream in the output images. So I would interpret this training as bringing the multilinguality in the pre-training stage, more so than in the fine-tuning stage. Obviously, there is some nuance because perhaps you have a lot of paired images that are labeled in your second languages, but whatever. Conversely, Stable Diffusion, and sorry, this figure is like completely different from the previous figure, so it's hard to look at a glance. But the key point here is that they focus on pre-training the image generator first. So they train this autoencoder to map their example images along a bunch of perceptual dimensions of interest into a good latent space. Then they take their training data and they train their conditioning vectors within that space after the space is already fixed. So super high level difference. And the last bit, if you don't know, is just that diffusion models are inverting this Markov chain, interpolating between natural image and pure noise in the latent space. Okay, those are all the background that is needed to get in here. Let's get back to the multilingual conceptual coverage. So like I said at the beginning, wanted to find those collisions. How do you do that? Well, just guess and check. So what I'm doing in this paper is basically taking a bunch of concepts. So in this example, dog, translating it into many different languages, and then just generating output images from a suite of different test models. And, oh, I need to. Oh, wow. Yeah, sorry. I just rejiggered my presenter view, and now I can actually read the slide from here. So that's a lot better than having to crane my neck. So yeah, in this work, we put together a novel benchmark to capture this. So how do we do it? First step is finding that list of concepts that we can then throw at the wall and check and compare. So I didn't want to impart any of my own biases for what concepts are relevant for testing into this process. So what I did was I collected just frequency lists from TV transcripts, from novels, and other sources in English, and then filtered those for nouns, filtered those for high quality nouns that I could find via translation using an ensemble of commercial translation systems and the Wikipedia/Wiktionary knowledge graph. So using all of the edges between words in different languages that are embedded within Wiktionary as a secondary check. And from that, I was able to get relatively high quality translations of these tangible nouns to what is often the most canonical translation of that tangible noun into the output languages, although there are some errors. I could talk about that more if you're interested, but for the most part, this works quite well. Then from those eliciting words, I can slot in my example words, so like airplane, into a prompts template for that language. So a photograph of an airplane, un photo de un avión, etc. And then prompt whatever model I want to test as a black box. And then the key point here is that I take a reference language, in most cases English, the primary language for which the model was trained, and I compare the whole population of images that are generated for each prompt in the reference language to the images that are generated in the test languages. And using just perceptual embeddings that are extracted from them. In this case, I used clip, but in principle, you could use any feature extractor. And I compare the populations against pre-computed embeddings in order to test for the distinctiveness of the images generated in a concept. I compare the reference language to the test language to check for correctness. And I compare the population of images to themselves to test for self-consistency. So we define these as the 3 criteria for a model to know a concept, is that it needs to be correct, it needs to be distinctive, and it needs to be self-consistent. Then we tested a pretty large set of models. So we tested the crayon.com models, which were originally called Dolly Mini and Dolly Vega. We tested multiple different stable diffusion checkpoints. We tested CogU2, which is an academic model that was trained with Chinese as the primary language rather than English. And then we tested Dolly2 and Alt Diffusion, which is the only explicitly multimodal text-image model. And I'll talk about that more when I get there. Oh, multilingual. They're all multimodal. I actually made that same mistake when I was giving the facts talk, and it made me cringe in the video. So thanks for catching me. So now no one listening here will be confused. So then we have some examples from the output. So this is the top figure from the paper. I'm not going to make you look at it this close. We'll zoom in. So there's a lot of different things that get captured here. So first off, we can find these same like collisions where when we test for dog, in the case of Dolly Mega, we see that the Latin script languages perform relatively well, whereas the non-Latin script languages we tested, which were Chinese, Japanese, and Hebrew, did not perform as well. But we also find that, first off, the concepts that fail are not consistent across models, even when models are trained on the same data resources. So comparing Stable Diffusion has more of a Japanese capability to produce dog than Chinese, and also better than Alt Diffusion. I'll blast through these pretty fast because this was sort of the thing that I put in last minute just as a presentation aid. But this is the sort of thing that's in the paper, is these zoomed in figures that you can look really close. And you can see this gradient where the better models are picking up more and more languages where they possess concepts. Unfortunately, Hebrew is often the worst language out of the one that we tested for almost all of the models, probably just because it has its own completely unique script that's not used for, well, I suppose it's used for Yiddish, but there's even less paired Yiddish image data than there is Hebrew, I would assume. But we find that the better models do tend to get better. And we do actually find that Alt Diffusion, which was trained with a explicitly multilingual encoder, does actually pick up some Hebrew capability.
Hebrew in it. Wait, go back a second.
Yeah.
Look at Indonesian now.
But exactly. It's a very tough balancing act here. And this is sort of, yeah, so cat dog. This is what's motivating my ongoing research direction. Now, the point of bringing up the airplane example here is if we go back to the example of Dolly Mega on dog, one assumption that I want to check against is that maybe generating like pictures of people's faces is just a generic failure case when it sees Sinaitic script languages. Like maybe, okay, these tokens are just totally out of my vocabulary, so I'm just defaulting to something. So that's really the purpose of comparing the within language across concept differences. So dog versus airplane, indeed, the failure cases are completely different. So it's not that Japanese is just doing pictures of people's faces no matter what for Dolly Mega. It's that when it sees dog, it is mapping to people's faces, but when it sees airplane, it's mapping to fields. Don't know why, but that is the behavior we're observing.
Do you know what the distributional fallout is in terms of general categories for just images? Like, are people distributional going to be overrepresented?
People probably are overrepresented, and probably especially for those languages.
And then landscapes as well.
Yeah, landscapes as well. So actually, that was another thing that we found was that contrary to the behavior in Japanese that I was pointing out here, for Hebrew in many of the models, no matter what you request, it basically gives generic Israel landscapes for many of the models. And I think the reason why that's happening is probably because the tokenizer is not allocating full words in Hebrew. It's just allocating single characters because it's often such like a rare character space. So often...
How's your vocabulary?
So usually these are using, they're using, for example, the clip text encoder. Many of the models use clip as a text encoder. Some of them use BART. Alt diffusion, which is the explicitly multilingual one, and which was also the only one that picked up dog in Hebrew. That one uses XLM BART as the encoder. So that's the only one that actually uses a tokenizer that is probably allocating, more fairly allocating subwords across different alphabets. Anyway, so hopefully this is giving you guys a bit of a flavor for like the sorts of analysis that this resource enables. But this isn't even the core point, because this is all qualitative. Let's get into the core. Oh wait, actually there's one other point to make here. So also we can test, in addition to testing these like animals and objects, we can test things related to people. So we can ask for faces, and sometimes you just get these weird like eldritch face mix things. So these are actually not great examples, but one thing to notice here is the ethnic bias in the image outputs for like Spanish and German versus Chinese for face, right? You're getting white faces versus Asian faces. So that leads into the quantitative results. So what these histograms are is that same correctness score that I presented earlier, the cosine similarity relative to English. And yes, that does have a circularity problem for English, but we'll talk about that in a second. For every single concept in the 200-word conceptual inventory. And right away, you can see that more rightward mass within that histogram means that more concepts are known within that language. We find that models that are primarily trained on English favor Latin alphabet languages. So in this case, Spanish, German, and Indonesian. Similarly, we find that CoCo-2, which is the model that was trained on Chinese data almost exclusively, generalizes slightly to Japanese, while it does not generalize as well to the Latin script languages. So that is a two-way road.
I mean, from that distribution, I can't see a significant difference between Japanese and other languages.
Yeah, it's very slight. The means are slightly better, but I don't have them on that graph. Also, alt diffusion, which is the only multilingual model, does perform the most consistently. So all the histograms are shifted to the right. But the interesting difference, so that's between this bottom right and all of the other ones, is that the histograms are kind of flattened out. So it's actually that when you use this multilingual encoder, some concepts do become transferred across all of them. So they get high scores, but the overall like the deviation of these distributions grows considerably. And then we can do the same thing with the other scores. So we can compare the models in terms of the inverse distinctiveness score, which is our measure of how specific the concepts are. And this is where we catch this effect in Hebrew, where all of the other models, or okay, not all the other models, but this histogram here is capturing the standard behavior of a model that generally knows the concepts. They have low inverse distinctiveness. What this histogram here is capturing for Chinese and Japanese is this behavior that I was pointing out before, where there are some specific collisions or correctly possessed concepts that are more leftward, then there are generic collisions that are more rightward. Then in Hebrew's case, we see these examples of the generic Israel landscape effect, where its inverse distinctiveness is way off to the right, because it's generating basically the same image no matter what you prompt. We can also compare the self-consistency. And here we get that same, well, the self-consistency was actually the least useful measure, so we don't have to talk about that too much. And then we can also compare, like, across all the models, the cross correlations of possession of a concept in language A versus the possession of it in language B. So, for example, we find that Spanish possession of a concept is more correlated to German possession of the concept than it is to Indonesian possession of the concept. But Indonesian possession, or sorry, Spanish against Indonesian is more correlated than Spanish against Japanese. This is the script sharing effect, I think.
So script is a big deal. They have a solution, right? Which is you could put everything in a consistent script.
Well, the problem, I guess, but it would just require, like it would require imposing. So you could have a mapping into Latin of all of the languages.
You have one. It's called UROM. You should look it up.
All right, I'll look.
It's not just us who use it, even though creating it. But it was used in some pretty high-profile multilingual work. So
no, this could be.
Yeah, it's imperfect, but he uses the Unicode table to try to guess what the pronunciation should be. But given that, so
This could be a collaboration opportunity, but go on.
no, the thing is, it's so good that it doesn't have to be. You can just use it out of the box. But not that we don't. I just want to promote hope. It's imperfect, right? But the fact that Indonesian seems to work pretty well a lot of the times tells me that, if script is your barrier, then just get over your barrier.
Well, here's the thing. I only think that would work if we applied that during the training process.
Yeah.
Like, I think what's going, like with Indonesian, we have this dual effect where it's not a low resource language. I would consider it like a middle resource language, especially in terms of what gets picked up in these like large multilingual pre-trained data sets. But I think the point is more that the subwords get to piggyback off the tokens that exist in the other languages because it's the script sharing. And that then it gets to piggyback off of those, and then for what little data is present, it gets a much better association between the tokens and the images. But for example, if we just in like a zero-shot setting, used that model to map the Chinese words into the Latin, it could only use whatever like data was present in training that was Romanized.
So if you have Vietnamese, you might get some.
Yeah, exactly. So Vietnamese.
I look forward to seeing your Romanized Hebrew thing generate pictures of fish.
And this is actually a discussion, like another discussion point that we've had on this project is because we're currently in the process of expanding this benchmark to more languages. And we talk about things like, for example, Hindi. Hindi is often written, especially in like colloquial online settings and text messages in the Latin alphabet. Anyway, I digress.
Another quick question, minor point. When you use English training data, does that contain any Chinese characters?
So yeah, that's
Wikipedia, for example. If you look at large English data, Wikipedia articles about Chinese people.
If they will contain the characters in
those characters, and that might then create bias towards faces. Whereas, like for dog,
that's
could be a article for dog, but just not need to refer to dog in other scripts.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And we have tools to easily detect different scripts. So.
Okay, I might have to look into that. Yeah, because I do think so some of these models were claimed to be trained exclusively on English-only data, and the mechanism of this is using mostly subsets of the Lion data set. I think the LID for the Lion data set is bad, and that's what's driving a lot of this. But yeah, the Wikipedia thing could be like, I wouldn't characterize that as bad LID. Like it shouldn't go in and excise, all of this doesn't match, this isn't English, this sub-segment of this document is not English, so we remove it. Like that wouldn't make sense. So that would also be
but it might introduce certain bias, right?
Yeah, and I agree. I think that would introduce the bias. So I think especially for like analyzing the Lion corpus, that would be a really interesting direction. Look into that. And also like that could be paired with like a topic model, right? So then you could say like, oh, this is a person related document, and we see this correlation between presence. So that's really interesting. Okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm a little bit rambly when I answer questions. So also these metrics are effective for picking out of the histogram concepts that work and don't. And just through direct inspection, we can confirm that these relatively contrived metrics of just comparing the extracted features from English to the other language are indeed predictive of possession of a concept. So, we sample this very rightward concept from the Spanish distribution. The concept is rabbit, the pictures are rabbits. Same thing for snow, guitar, etc. And when we sample from the leftward concepts, we both find concepts that probably shouldn't be in the corpus, like prince, where it's mapping to pet names, people, toys, etc. Like it's a bit of a too underspecified of a concept. And then we also find examples where it fails, like Hebrew. These are not pictures of eyes, these are pictures of landscapes. So then at the end of this first paper, we tried to show how we can tie back into this message of complex creativity by using the extracted concepts. And basically what we found is that possession of a concept as detected by our metrics is necessary but not sufficient for generalizing to these creative prompts, which kind of an obvious like assumption to make, but it's still useful to demonstrate it. So we only did this on a small set of prompts. So I'll give you 2 examples. One is the prompt, a bird using a keyboard in the snow. This is not a likely image to exist in the natural distribution. And we can find, like for a given model language pair, okay, possession of bird, keyboard, and snow. And, you know, even if the model thinks it possesses bird, it can still completely fail. It will just generate, you know, do the generate pictures of people fallback that we do often observe in Japanese. But also, we can find examples where, okay, it possesses bird, it possesses snow, but it does not possess keyboard. And as predicted, it is able to generate a picture of a bird in the snow. So sometimes the models will just ignore the unpossessed concepts. Other times they'll completely fail. And I think this is a direction for future investigation.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the point here is, a big point here is that in Spanish, there's no keyboard, right?
In Japanese, there is no keyboard in this one. Oh, but yes, exactly. But also, even if our metric predicts that it possesses keyboard, it still might fail.
And there's no, like, it doesn't have it a lot, right? Like, there's not like a number above which it could try to integrate these things.
There's not a number.
There's not a number. Well,
right, exactly. There's no score for possession after which we can say it's necessary that it will succeed on a creative prompt containing this concept. This is more of like a lower bound thing. But I still think this can be useful where we can find so I'll go to the next slide, which is our other example, which is a dog made of fire standing on the moon. So this is sort of getting at more the direction I'm interested in, because the bird using a keyboard in the snow, it is interesting, but really it's just taking 3 objects that are not usually present in a scene and putting them together. I'm more interested in, like, can we measure the relational knowledge? So can we measure the made of relation, dog made of fire, right? And what I think we can do with tests like this is we can find natural A/B tests within a model where the semantically equivalent prompt is only partially understood in language A, but fully understood in language B. And I think we could scale this test to try to enhance the discoverability of failure cases. But I don't know, this is very, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so when you evaluate whether a success or failure based on the prompts, is it mostly just still a manual process of looking at the images and seeing whether it fulfilled it, or do you have something else in terms of the entire prompt, whether it was faithfully complete?
So yes, so testing faithfulness of the full prompt. In this study, we just used manual inspection of the images, and this is really more, these are suggestive results. These are not definitive final results, but I'm just gesturing at this as a potential direction that this tool would enable further inquiry of. And now we get to the first part of the title, which is the differential biases between languages. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I have one question.
Yeah.
So previously in the success cases and failure cases, what is the similarity based on clip? Because if clip cannot capture it, it's definitely not going to work, right?
If clip, yes. So we kind of arbitrarily, we didn't arbitrarily, based on a careful analysis of the numbers that were present for English, we picked a threshold over which the cosine similarity, we would call it possessed. But that is more of a judgment call than an objective decision. Does that answer your question?
So is there a distribution, like you can directly identify what's
yeah. So what I'm doing here with these check marks is, so here's the same number, this like WC, right? This has been normalized to the 0 to 1 range, but this is like those same scores. What we would be doing there is saying, okay, let's say this line is our threshold for everything above it is a concept that's possessed, everything below it is a concept that's not possessed. That's the way that we were like making those judgment calls. And that's how you maybe scale this to an experiment, is that we get now this curve of like, okay, here are the concepts that are present, here are the ones that aren't, and then we can do this A/B test within model across languages. Okay, so now to the bias part. So when we looked more carefully at the image outputs subjectively, we found a lot of interesting results. We found that both cultural knowledge and also problematic biases are captured and encoded within the models. So first off, if you had to guess, these 3 sets of images are all pictures of dogs generated in different languages. Which one do you think is Japanese? Right. Yep. So this is pretty interesting. Just naturally within the distribution of images, we're capturing knowledge about what in an underspecified case is a dog. But it gets more problematic. So if you ask in the underspecified case for a picture of hair, what are the characteristics of the hair that's going to get generated? We're encoding basically ethnic stereotypes about the speaker population. Also, if you ask for a picture of a doctor, what is the ethnicity of the doctor and are they male or female? Those biases are also captured and encoded within the models. Interestingly, Indonesian is picking white doctors and English is picking Asian doctors for this model. And there is some differences across them. But also, and most problematically, there have been results showing just in the English only domain that there are differential rates of sexualization, for example, in pictures of women that are generated. So what happens when we have a model that has this within a cross-language bias towards different ethnicities in the pictures that it generates in an underspecified case, and then also a within the image domain differential rate of sexualization of pictures. We get this compound result where pictures of women in Spanish are more sexualized than pictures of women in German, and pictures of women in Japanese are more sexualized than the pictures of women in Spanish. So how can we fix this? Well, alt diffusion is the one model that uses the multilingual encoder. And in principle, what their actual process is they take a pre-trained stable diffusion model, and then they take this XLM BART encoder, which already has a multilingual representation space, and then they just train it on this contrastive objective. Make the outputs of this model align as closely as possible to the existing clip conditioning embeddings. And while that does reduce the bias across languages, it reduces the sexualization bias, for example. It also completely erases the distinctive cultural knowledge. So we no longer see a difference in what is encoded for pictures of a dog. And the picture of dog is a relatively benign example, but there's a lot of other types of cultural knowledge that get embedded, like, for example, a wedding, different cultural weddings across different languages. Yeah, food. Yeah, so we do have some examples for that, and that's in a study that we're hopefully going to put on archive by December 15th for no particular reason.
December.
Or January 15th, actually.
Yeah.
I was hoping to have it done yesterday, but life happens.
For single word, this might not work so well, but I wonder, like, a comparison of alt diffusion versus a translate test-based approach where you just run everything through machine translation. It's more complicated.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And you have predicted one of the next things I'm going to show. Not the next slide, but yeah, in a couple of slides from now. So first off, all of the results now, these are sort of the contents of what I presented at ACL and FACS this year. And this raised some questions. So, I mean, the fundamental problem always is that the biases in the training data are going to be reflected in the outputs. So biases in terms of what languages are represented, biases in terms of demographic properties of images that are present. And it is very important to audit and clean the data resources. And hopefully this resource that we've produced can be useful in guiding that process in terms of the output models that actually result. But additionally, we have this broader meta question of, like, what is responsible multilingual text to image? Because there's this inherent tension between improving the performance across many different languages, which are all competing for, like, representational real estate, and also, preserving what cultural knowledge is possessed, and also reducing the cross-lingual biases. It produces this kind of simplex of considerations where it's very difficult to optimize one without affecting others. Like we saw it in that example where the one model that possessed dog in Hebrew lost dog in Indonesian, right? There is a big tension going on here. And so I think a lot of input is necessary. So now we'll get into the preview results on sort of what we've been doing about this. So like John suggested, he had this idea of performing a translation. Now, when I've been thinking about how to deal with and understand diffusion models, I think people are really underrating the role that luck and the random seed that you start with and other elements in the sampling process plays. Because when you generate an image from the diffusion model, you're starting from some initialization, performing this like stochastic walk through the stepwise space that is encoded within the model updates. And whenever you constrain the location of the state of the model at some point in time, you are in turn constraining the output possible images in the output space. And what I'm showing here with these cones is this idea that, you know, it's starting from random noise, performing a walk in terms of t to some output image. And it's being trained on a bunch of sparse examples in this image space. And it's taking a example, inverting it some number of time steps, which because it's just a, you know, Markov chain that's fully defined, we know that there is a cone of possible states that can be visited by the model in the output image space, given time step initialization point. And similarly, given a trained model, when we are generating a new one, given constraint at some point in the space, there is a constrained set of possible output images that are present. So this has been leveraged for the purpose of making more efficient decoding. So one of my lab mates made this work where basically they stored a bunch of intermediate states of the generation process and then sampled from those rather than starting at the beginning from noise to generate images. So for example, they take the saved state for a cat holding a cup, sample that intermediate value, but run it forward given the prompt, a dog holding a cup. And it is a more efficient way to get that output. I'm thinking, why don't we leverage that by doing an intermediate swap of the language? So,
sorry. The idea is the prompt is a dog holding a cup. You find essentially the nearest neighbor
yes.
to that, which is cat holding a cup, as it turns out. Grab that and then continue. Finish
exactly.
Using dog.
Exactly. So this is an existing paper that my lab mate did. We leverage that, but instead of finding a near neighbor from a key value pair, we use that same reasoning of, you know, starting from some constrained state or getting to a constrained state and then swapping, and instead perform the early steps in an English translation of the word using like the Google Translate API, then switch to the target language. And we find that first off, in the zero-shot settings, greatly improves the performance, and it significantly improves the consistency, enabling us to do closer comparisons directly between them. So we find that almost all of the secondary semantic characteristics of this image, like the structure, the positioning, or maybe that's actually the primary semantics and the secondary is the features, whatever. The point is we can constrain the structure and then really directly see that the language conditioning and the language conditioning alone is driving the demographic differences.
Hold on a second. So you have Frau, you have the prompt is actually Frau.
Yeah.
And you start off by running that through machine translation, you get woman.
Woman, yes.
Then you do 5.
Then you do 10% of the steps.
10% of the steps with woman. And then what?
Then we have that state.
Yeah.
We switch back to Frau.
Oh, so there's no
and run the rest of the way. Well, there's no retrieval in this case. Yeah. It's just inspired by that idea of reusing trajectories, but not retrieval.
Why just do one point, right? You could do a bunch of them.
Exactly.
The next slide.
It's not the next slide, but it is what I'm experimenting with right now. Now, in practice, that's hard because basically what I'm trying to get at here is that we can, first off, we can use it as an analytical tool. So we can also use this to identify more specific cases of knowledge by holding the structure constant. So when we look for a picture of a garden and we constrain the primary structure of the image by doing this process, it really, in a striking way, shows that, okay, the German garden has this like Eurocore house in the background. The Chinese garden has this like pagoda thing. And the only difference between these images, once again, is that the seed was swapped from English to that language midway through. So it really is being captured within the model.
Oh, that's actually the same English version.
This is the same English initialization and then halfway through swapping. And just that swap alone gives this big of a semantic difference. We can also find really striking examples of the demographic differences, but this is also where we start running into problems. So, for example, for whatever reason, Stable Diffusion 2, when I generate an English eye, it generates this creepy orb eye on the side. But for whatever reason, and it does the same thing as well in Spanish, there's just a lot of noise and a lot of like finickiness, and that's why I didn't make the NatGo archive deadline. But yeah, hopefully I will fix it by the ACL archive deadline. And I really do think this is a promising direction. And we're playing with terms for this. We're thinking about calling it polyglot decoding, but this is basically a training-free way to improve, or not necessarily to improve performance, but to visit more locations on that trade-off in the space between, you know, losing knowledge by fine-tuning or adapting a multilingual encoder versus, you know, just raw dogging with whatever made it through why did I say that? Just this is what happens when you go completely off the cuff on an unrehearsed talk. Yeah, so anyway, you guys know what I meant. So yeah, this is really just the first release of this resource. Right now we just have the 200 concepts across 7 languages. We're currently in the process of expanding it. We're hoping to hit 30 languages, and we're trying to expand beyond nouns to verbal concepts, adjectival concepts, and other things. And yeah, happy to take any questions.
You had this wonderful opportunity to do it koala, and you went with CoCo-CroLa.
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 CoCo-CroLa. You want CoCo-CroLa?
I wanted CoCo-CroLa.
CoCo-CroLa.
Yeah, why not CoCo-CroLa?
Just koala. You know.
I feel like koala is already out there.
Yeah,
So,
There's also not a second A, so you can actually do it like properly.
and if you go to the benchmark website, like I made like a cute little logo for it that I can show you. No, whatever. That's stupid.
It's
Stupid.
getting sued website.
Fair use.
Yes.
But yeah. So, any questions? That's the end of it.
Question with the I slide.
The I slide, yes.
Yeah.
This I slide.
Yes. So on the top row is not doing any interventions because it says seed 0. Oh, seed. That's a seed value. Not that.
Yes.
Is it also 20
Yep.
steps?
Yes. Oh, so that's actually a great point. So these are pulled straight out of just like a document where I had results because I didn't make the archive deadline. So it's like, you know, let's use the figures that I have. And yes, so these outputs are like that. That is an interesting distinction. So I don't have the figures here, but this is actually when you start from a fixed seed from the very beginning, just prompting in German and Indonesian. It has an identical structure. So sometimes we serendipitously have the exact same structure without even having to do the polyglot decoding. But also this output behavior is relatively, or sorry, this is actually showing the problem of that approach, which is that when we start in English for 100 steps and then switch to Indonesian, this distinctiveness is lost. But I don't have this slide, but if we start in German and switch to Indonesian, it actually does preserve the structure. So there's a lot of sensitivity to the initial conditions of it just getting totally messed up by this like weird, gross orb instead of an I coming out for English.
Well, but the furthest to the right is sort of, I think, more faithful to the prompt itself, right?
To just the fundamental
Like,
I.
because it's an I. Like, you know, like,
Yeah.
it would just really
Is your prompt I in German or Indonesian or English?
It's a picture of an I in German or Indonesian or English.
Prompt is this?
The prompt is a picture of. We found that improves.
What do you mean in German? There's a picture.
Well, I don't speak German, but it's
Oh,
like
sorry.
un foto de un ojo,
Yeah,
a picture of an eye.
Oh, okay. I thought the prompt itself was a actual image.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, the prompt is literally a picture of X.
Probably should change that because it looks like the prompt is German I.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, thank you for yeah.
You also go back the other slide
This one.
with the women. Yeah. Thank you.
So this is similar. This is 100 steps of a picture of a woman followed, or 10 steps of a picture of a woman followed by 90 steps of Odinano Shashi.
What does EN50 stand for? Is it number of steps?
After 50 out of 100, or 50 out of 1,000. Yeah, sorry, I'm giving you guys so much misinfo. But these are very like,
Right, smaller difference.
yeah, very, very minor differences. But yeah, sorry, 5% of the steps are in English followed by the switch, not 10%. There is a 10% experiment, but
Wait, so I'm not understanding why you think the I result is particularly a weak result, because it feels like if the image itself, the original image itself is like
I
not
see.
really you know, I don't know where's there, especially since the beginning and
So-
it's already black and white. How much like diversity or preservation of culture are you expecting?
You're right. So there's an interpretation of this that this is a strong result because this is driving parity between the languages. And if we define parity in terms of our metrics as the goal, then almost tautologically doing this process is going to drive the distribution of the images for non-English languages closer to the English distribution. And there are cases where that is the goal. So I think there's a lot of things going on here. So that we should disentangle. So first off, in all three of these examples, I don't think you can argue that the model does not possess I, right? Like this is a successful I possession, just in a different way of showing than this is, right? But our metric interpolates between like these would score relatively far off from each other compared to these. But then also we have those examples where it's like picture of Jerusalem landscape versus an airplane, right? And we're interpolating between all of those. So like in the total failure regime, getting improvement along our metrics is very significant and desirable. But within the, within the like differences between languages regime, it might flip to being undesirable, or at the very least, it's like less informative. So that's a bit of nuance that goes with this. But you're right, like this could be thought of as an improvement. So yeah, go ahead. No, that was it.
What is this? What happens if you switch partway through with like just unrelated terms?
With unrelated terms.
Yeah, just change from one word to another word or whatever. Like, do you actually get effect of the first word? Let's just forget multilingual for a moment. Just say, we just go from I to
yeah.
To,
so that's closer to this what was going on in this paper, and there have been other results showing things like this. So, for example, there was a paper that was pretty big on Twitter. Like, I'm so Twitter brained. That was pretty big on Twitter like a year and a half ago, I think. Where, and I can't recall what the title was, but they actually showed that instead of using random noise as the initialization, you can just use a natural image as the initialization state, and then perform the diffusion process, and it effectively just becomes image-to-image editing. So it's just a matter of like what time step are you starting at? Like, so once again, that's really what this slide is showing, right? So it's showing that the possible output images that you can visit is a function of the time state that the model is at when the initialization takes place. So if you initialize at time step 0, it can completely interpolate between any pair of images because the prior here is all possible pixel space images to this output of like any.
I guess be thinking, recall the creative prompts slides where
Yes.
you had like the dog and the fire, dog.
Yes, dog made a fire standing on the moon.
Like, so what if we started with something that is more like semantically less creative? Let's say dog made of, I don't know, something that makes more sense standing on something else. Like these two concepts being something more like semantically possible, I guess, and then probable, like high probable in language modeling or whatever, I don't know. And then like take that maybe up to like 10% of the steps and then switch it to fire on the moon. And maybe we have something better. I don't know.
That's a great suggestion. And this is where I wish I was better at preparing reserved slides, because that was a bit of a sidetrack control that I did. Was the question of, so the hypothesis that we had was, let's say the model knows dog and it knows frisbee, but it doesn't know park in language A, but it knows park in language B. What happens if you say a dog playing frisbee in the field, right? Maybe it will leverage the knowledge it has from English that field co-occurs with those and generate it. And we actually found that it often doesn't. Like it can, but it does not seem to do this. But I think that was a very like anecdotal result. But I think this tool could be used to test something like that. Yeah. To test like, can it leverage this like secondary knowledge?
I'm actually interested to see if you went from like a problem that I have with all these generations. This example is that I don't see any dog made of fire.
Yeah, the closest one. This is maybe on fire.
Yeah. So
I would say this one is made of fire. Maybe. But it's not standing on the moon.
I wonder if you could do something like you said, you can do the image interpolation. Clearly, I'm like not so up on stable diffusion and
that's
okay to do, right? But like, so you could start by extracting the nouns and just say like a dog, fire, the moon, and then generate that image, and then go from there to a dog made of fire standing on the moon. And I wonder if you'd get better results, because like at least anecdotally, when I'm trying to generate images, I get very frustrated with the lack of
grammaticality doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. It's pretty bad at following. I mean, It's so much better than anything that used to exist, of course, but instantly my expectations are raised, right? So, yeah, I can't get to do it.
Yeah.
Anything I really want to.
Yeah. So I don't have a strong stance on how to fix the compositionality. I'm more interested in trying to make a tool that like gets us to those A/B tests for the compositionality. But yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting direction too. There's, I don't know, there's a million directions that I want to go in, and I want to do them all at once. Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that most of these models use some kind of like classificatory guidance or like guidance towards how they generate according to the text. Have you tried manipulating that before you actually jump to the 10% switch thing?
So
because it determines how strongly you follow the text.
Right. So manipulating like the guidance scale. Yeah. I have not really experimented with that as a variable, but you're right. That is, I think especially when so these results at the end are really like, this is more like a preview preliminary results, but yeah, you're right that when we're looking at things like this, like the guidance scale is a very important variable to consider. And I also think that it's really important to separate out, once again, the use of this initialization in English as a control for like experimentation versus use as like a mitigation. But yeah, I mean, definitely to like make a strong claim about the influence of German or Chinese, certainly the experiment has to be performed at multiple guidance scales. Yeah.
Well, no, this is like completely, maybe I'm blanked, but would this be a solution for the problem that you showed in the first part where you were not able to generate dogs at all in some languages?
Yes. Yes. So I think that's, once again, because this is a like 45% finished paper, I don't have nice figures showing all of these results, but it is the case that I think what goes on basically is that if you make it far enough if you get to a constrained enough cone of possible output images, eventually the structure is so defined that just the like unconditioned prior over update steps that you can perform, it basically just becomes like using the diffusion model as like a decoder from like a compression. So you can get it to a state where dogs are more likely, but in practice, it's closer to the end. Like the 10% or 5% initialization doesn't really get you there.
And another question I had was,
sorry, ask the question, but that's also what this figure is showing here. So this is showing the diffusion process move forward, and like as it gets closer and closer, and there's different like scales at which the noise updates can be performed. So this one is pretty slowly moving out of noise and then aggressively hitting the final structure. But like, yeah, I don't know. Hopefully you kind of get what I'm getting at here. So what's your question?
So the other question I had was about exclusion of Hebrew for the second part of the talk. Is that because it was, I don't know, not controllable in the way that you wanted it to be, or?
Exclusion of Hebrew in the parts with the biases? Yes. The reason why we don't look at it in these experiments is because the questions of like what knowledge is possessed versus what biases possess is really only relevant if the model has the concept. So when it doesn't, it wouldn't tell us much informative. But yes, I think the reason why it is important to be considered in this wider like multivariate optimization problem is that, tying back to the example where picking up Hebrew dog knowledge came at the cost of Indonesian cat, or came at the cost of Indonesian dog knowledge, right? I think that, similarly, we should consider like this Hebrew dog knowledge that also came at the cost of Japanese Shiba Inu versus generic dog knowledge, which also comes at the cost of Asian person hair versus white person hair in the language, which also comes at the cost of like all of these things are connected when you perform these interventions. So that's like the other core message here is that we have to look when we're performing like multilingual model development and trying to propose new algorithms, we have to consider these different variables that are in tension with each other. And it really depends on what your desiderata are. Yes?
So I'm curious about your thoughts on with the introduction of more and more AI generated images, including like the contextualization examples, these AI generated images of bodies and this kind of thing. Just that, so we have like multiple models shaping the cultural reference point for bias, and how does that, how do you see that kind of feeding into the effects that we're seeing?
How do I see?
How do you see that feeding in that there's so there's a large set of it's the data that's going in that is encoding these cultural concepts and biases.
Yes, yes.
And there is going to be this increasing flow into that training data
Of synthesized images. Yeah. Yeah, I'm very concerned about that. I think so I am concerned about it on the bias perpetuation side, but I'm also on just a more fundamental level. I'm concerned about it from like a, what happens when we can't filter out generated text from Wikipedia, when like eventually it does just become this like Ouroboros, and like we're losing like reality. But
it's worse than that, because you also have the problem of a shift towards a generated source of information, which could lead to just less
runaway,
less participation in the creation of data to begin with. So what happens when nobody's adding anything to core anymore?
Yeah, and I'm very concerned about that.
It just it makes me think of this kind of if you have two mirrors.
Just the endless, and it's just all and it's all dark.
Google had a paper on this back in 2007 when they were concerned that their machine translation training approach was corrupted by Google Translate output, and so that they started watermarking even back then. And that's obviously a way to go forward. But the thing is, so if you're ethical, you allow your stuff to be watermarked in at least a way that you can detect. That's not even ethical. That's like pragmatic. That's what Google does, right? So they watermark their outputs in like simple ways, but that's why I worry more about the stuff is so good now we just don't need to contribute. So now you just have that. I worry less about images and posting now.
That topic is a big downer. What's your question?
I was thinking that you're using English as a pivot language. Does that add to some cultural bias in any way?
Yes.
And is it like, do you have results from that?
Not that I can show. But so the other problem that I'm running into is that right now I'm really relying on subjective analysis to analyze the cultural variables. And it's a bit of a problematic area to get into when it's like, okay, do I need to train a race classifier to make this like system work well? But luckily, Mohit Bansal's group already did that for me, so I can just use their classifier. But I think like the complete work on like this direction of swapping languages is going to require like an analysis of what bias is imparted by English as a pivot language. And the other point is testing as a control, doing the literal prompt, a German eye, in addition to a photo of an eye in German. I have a lot of work to do.
I was also wondering, like, if for the starting pivot point, instead of we just use English, which is like the most rich resource language. Average among the languages of interest, can we see a more generalized concepts for what is do you think it is?
So I think what you're talking about here is doing like a walk through multiple languages. So maybe you do the first 10 steps in English, and then maybe every single step sample a language. Maybe sample.
Yeah, and then somehow average them combined.
Yeah. So I mean, I think averaging them is a good proposal. I also think that's a very practical solution for the demographic bias problem. So there are works on fairness, enforcing like demographic balance in the outputs when you ask for like pictures of a doctor. A really practical way that you could fix that. Like a lot of what these people are doing are intervening on the prompt by saying a picture of a female doctor. Like we will insert 50% of the time female, we will insert male 50% of the time. We'll insert further labels, but a more pragmatic way might be to just sample a language, translate it, run forward for some number of steps and swap back. Yeah, cool. Okay, so we're a little bit over time. Thank you all for your attention now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael, for such an amazing talk. I had a great time, and I think all the questions, based on the questions, it seems like everybody really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for coming to the ISS Seminar. Next week we'll be off because of Thanksgiving, but the week after we'll have Kawi and Etha come from Stanford. So that will be actually our last seminar for this year. But anyways, thank you so much, and let's keep in